We're in St. John's Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, only a stone's throw from Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where 121 victims from the Titanic disaster are buried. But wind the clock back 39 years from that, and another White Star Line tragedy befell Nova Scotia, the sinking of the ocean liner Atlantic on April 1st, 1873. One of the heroes of that disaster is buried on the hillside in St. John's Cemetery. This is the grave of Reverend William Ancient. Ancient was born in Croft, England in 1836. He joined the Royal Navy as an ordinary seaman, serving in the Crimean War and various other deployments until 9 years later when he became an official Royal Navy scripture reader. He was assigned to Terence Bay, Nova Scotia, about a dozen miles southwest of Halifax in the late 1860s, as a deacon missionary for the Anglican Church and officially ordained a reverend in 1872. In Terence Bay, he expanded the church and built a schoolhouse, but he was most famous for his actions during the sinking of the Atlantic. When the ship came to grief on the rocks of nearby Lower Prospect, many of the townsfolk were on the scene to quickly help with all that they could. Reverend Ancient was a late arrival. By the time he arrived, the rescue was already mostly over. He came to the site of the disaster to find both exhausted survivors and exhausted rescuers resting on the rocky shore with the Atlantic, mostly sunk, sitting 100 or so feet offshore. The waves were pounding, but there were still 3 people stuck high up in the rigging of the ship. Ancient asked why no efforts were being made to rescue them, and he was told that they were impossible to reach due to the rigging of the ship making it unsafe to row to them. Well, this didn't sit well with Ancient, and he mustered up a boat crew, or perhaps even shanghaied them, and rowed them out to the wreckage. Like the fishermen before him, he couldn't get close enough to the mast, but instead coaxed the poor, trapped people to move forward to where they could be rescued. He found that one of the 3 in the mast, a young lady, was already dead, her mouth foaming, still lashed to the mast, as her husband watched in despair from the shore. Now only 2 people remained aboard, a male passenger and the ship's chief officer. The passenger grew tired of waiting, grabbed a life buoy from one of the nearby bodies, and leapt into the sea. He was dashed against the wreckage, but Reverend Ancient grabbed him before he was killed. Rescuing Chief Officer Firth was a greater challenge. He couldn't swim. Instead, Reverend Ancient climbed aboard Atlantic, hauled himself through the waves to the base of the mast, and threw a line to Firth, who caught it and fell into the sea. In the fall, Officer Firth was smashed against the ship and broke his shins, crying out. Ancient called back, "Never mind your shins, it's your life we're after." Ancient and his men hauled Firth aboard the boat and brought the 2 final survivors to Mars Island. Though the disaster occurred in Canada, the people of the United States were so moved by the story that they took up collections to help the survivors and reward the rescuers. One of the gifts given was this golden pocket watch gifted to Reverend Ancient and now sits in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Reverend Ancient oversaw the burial of around 277 victims of the Atlantic disaster, making up the majority of the Protestant passengers and crew killed in the wreckage. Ancient was rightly applauded as a hero for his actions, but mistakenly given the credit for leading the rescue. He didn't lead it. He arrived at the very tail end of it, but he did save the final survivors from the wreckage. Some of the locals felt as though Ancient was given undue attention. Local fishermen had rescued over 400 people from the ship, while Ancient rescued only 2. Yet Ancient was given all of the accolades and brought out to lavish award ceremonies, and this was attention that he gladly accepted. Some locals, including Sarah Jane O'Reilly, who cared for nearly all of the survivors after they were rescued, seems to have believed that it was because Reverend Ancient was an Englishman, while the local fishermen were all Irish and mostly Catholic. The publicity he received from the disaster helped him rise up through the ranks of the Anglican Church in Nova Scotia, becoming the secretary-treasurer of the diocese. He died in 1908 and was buried here. Initially, the grave likely had a wooden marker that rotted and was removed. For decades, Ancient's grave was unmarked, until an American group called Shrouded Veterans began a fundraising effort to put a proper stone on his grave. Donors came from all over, including members of the Titanic International Society and the Titanic Society of Atlantic Canada. The stone was placed and dedicated in late 2021. Reverend Ancient's church at the time of the wreck of the Atlantic was called St. Paul's Anglican Church in Terence Bay. It burned down in 1942. However, the foundations of the building are still visible. 3 park benches have even been erected on the foundation. For a full telling of the story of the Atlantic disaster, you can find several documentaries on my personal YouTube channel, Part-Time Explorer, including an old one which I made in 2018, and a larger production published only recently for the 150th anniversary, which includes the animations that you saw in this video. To help keep the story of these old ships alive, consider a membership to the Titanic International Society at the link below. They offer a quarterly publication filled with articles written by historians, and their most recent edition is dedicated to the SS Atlantic disaster.